The language that I use for producing these podcasts and on my site is very carefully considered. I really try very hard not to use a lot of jargon and to use very simple concepts in as plain a language as I can find. And of course, I want to get that out as often as possible and as far and wide as possible. So I am, constantly, working on the language of my website. And I'm also working on my SEO, my search engine optimization. And I've been diligently trying to think through that. And one of the considerations that I've kind of come to is that in developing keywords for my site and for the language that I use, I found that I am very constricted. That a lot of the language that I want to use is not really a language that is widely recognized by the search engines. It doesn't really seem to resonate with that. And it's a strange thing, and I really wonder about it. And what I wonder is that how much is this situation that we're in today like the situation of Babel in Genesis 11? And I wonder, is the confining of our thinking and constraining of our language something that we should be very well aware of with regards to our ability to connect to the divine hierarchy? It is a squeezing of our ordinary reality and our ordinary consciousness down to a point where a lot of language is unacceptable. It does not resonate as a keyword, as it were. So I've been thinking about that a lot, and what I'm coming to conclude is that the text in Genesis 11 is very powerful because it really elucidates and points out to the very problem that we're having today with the powers that be. So it's clearly not a new problem. It's an old problem. And I want to go through chapter 11 very lightly, a kind of a glancing blow on chapter 11. And I want to kind of bring to the idea of verse 1, which is that they had one language, the people of Babel. And that's a very much an analogous understanding to what's happening today, that our language is being so reduced to what is acceptable that there is an attempt to have us all speak one language. And let me give you an example of that with artificial intelligence and how AI and machine language are working to expose what is called bias. So if you look at larger corporations, they are analyzing language to a degree where they are beginning to understand the phraseology that might indicate somebody is biased. And that bias is being identified, and individuals are coerced into correcting their language because in the eyes of the creators of this nightmare scenario, that bias is dangerous, very dangerous stuff. So one of the things that also happens in the text is in verse 6, it says, "Nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible." And of course, to me, that means that they have a consolidated consciousness. Their ordinary consciousness is being conformed to a point where that mass of conscious energy and effort will bring results which are undesirable. So nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible. So that's the goal, I think, of a lot of those who want to conform and constrain our language so that nothing that they want to do will be impossible. And then in verse 9, it says that their language was confused and they were scattered. That's a very powerful piece. And this iconic understanding, which comes from Genesis 11, is really a powerful text. And there's a lot of open-endedness to it. It's not tightly woven together, as it were. There's a lot of thinking that can go on around it and through it. And I want to stay with that a little bit. So the unspoken thing here is, who is the one responsible for this advent of one language, of one consciousness, of purposes that are outside of the bounds of the divine, where the divine has had to say, oh, darn, look at this. This is not such a good thing. So where did that come from? And it comes from personalities banding together to create energies which satisfy only the needs of the personalities. But because those needs, those personalities, are not connected to the divine hierarchy, it is chaos and destruction. So what is left in place of this? Well, in my mind, it is a resident divine hierarchy of angels, of which we are part. So it's a little bit of a complicated sort of scenario, but if you think about it, language is taking a second place to our connection with the divine. Language is not as important as our connection and experience with the divine. That is an important thing. But there are ways to communicate. So, as some of you know, my hobby is archaeology. And one of the things I was looking at a while back is the language of the Babylonians and early Hebrew and Aramaic, which is the language called cuneiform. And it's a language which is, done by small impressions made into clay using a number of little symbols. So it's soft clay with a little sharp stick, which makes impressions in the clay, which represent symbols, which are a language, a symbolic language, which can be understood. So I'm saying, if every word that you speak is being recorded by somebody somewhere, even when your phone is not turned on, it is listening. Every word that you utter, by and large, is being identified and put through an AI machine language computer to tell whether or not you're biased. So now, instead of it just being in the context of corporate realities and the language of the company memo, it's now all language all the time, every time, is being recorded and understood, which is a scary thing. And it goes back to, of course, the idea of one language. Genesis chapter 11, verse 1, one language. So who is responsible for that one language? Who is doing the algorithms that are being used in machine language to understand who is biased? So there's just an effort, again, to compel humankind to one language. So the text in Genesis sort of indicates that everybody was in it all together, and oh yeah, we're going to have one language, and man, we're going to do all kinds of stuff, and whatever we want, we can make happen. But I think that there's a clear sort of open end that says that could very well be that the tower builders were not necessarily all in agreement. There may have been some who disagreed. And I think that's the case today, that there are some who disagree. So how do we begin to comport our language with the understanding that our bias is being sought after to be exterminated? It's a pretty strong word, but our bias is being quelled. We are not allowed to have unique or individual bias. But the text says you're going to have different languages. What does that mean? Well, that's the topic of the meditation. That is what I'm talking about. So supposing that you said, well, if all my language is being monitored and everything that I say is being queried for bias, where does that leave me? Well, it leaves you perhaps back, and this is a little bit of zany speculation, it leaves you back to the idea of cuneiform, of creating your own language with symbols that are unique to you and to your family. So if you looked at a video, of which there's a few, on how to write cuneiform and how to use these very simple symbols and the combination of these symbols. There's not very many symbols. There's only like 3 or 4 symbols pieced together to come up with a language. And as I said, you can, from the use of this cuneiform technique, use multiple languages to express yourself. So that's the research that I've seen. So there's one set of symbols that can communicate in multiple languages. So supposing you and your family developed a series of symbols that were in fact a language of your family that you could use to communicate with each other in ways that could not be easily deciphered. Somebody, easily, could put some major computing power into what you're creating and, crack it fairly fast. But I don't know that there would be enough computing power out there to do the language cracking of every single family in the United States or around the world, and what good would it do? Because you could change your central signals, central glyphs, as it were, in ways that would then shift your language. So you would have a constantly evolving language based on symbols. And of course, you could then take a picture rather than sending a text. So it won't be long before the pictures will be able to be deciphered. But nevertheless, it's a way to go ahead and begin to create a uniqueness within the context of your use of your own language and the language of your family or a larger community. So that the larger effect is that you are not subjected to the overwhelming and overpowering consciousness that occurs in a controlled community imagery. And a good example of that, of course, would be the halftime show of yesterday and all of the commercials and the similarities of them, what they're trying to communicate, the boundaries of that kind of communication, what was allowed, what was not allowed, what images did you see that harmonized? How did those images stay together? And I can tell you that all those commercials and all that stuff was carefully monitored. It was curated, to use a modern word, so that there was a continuity of message, that the consciousness of those creators of all of this was consistent. They were very careful to make sure that there was no outliers. There was nothing there which would, create a distinction. There was a oneness of this, a cultural oneness and a linguistic oneness and a oneness of image. There is a consistency through this. And how much does that resonate with you about what the divine saw when such things are seen and understood? It's an affront. It is absolutely an antithetical consciousness. It is an adverse or perverse consciousness which is being forced upon us. It is foisted. And we are sometimes defenseless because we are so subject to mass communications. So I'm saying to you, individualize your communications. Find a way to communicate with your family first, and then close friends in ways that are more subtle. Try and find a language that, is euphemisms or glyphs or little impressions that are made to communicate what it is you and your family believe and what you might say to one another. I think one of them is the symbol of the fish. It's really a powerful symbol. The fisherman. So using your own ability to create and to communicate with your family and those close to you, develop ways to communicate with each other that are unique to you and your family. Because it's going to be a time when our communications that are public are going to be so closely monitored, we're just not going to want to say anything. But that doesn't keep us from imagining our connection with the divine and using our imaginal connection to find inspiration and to find new direction, which is our calling in the divine hierarchy, to move creation forward. That was another thing that came out of that text that I saw, is that the builders of the Tower of Babel were not pushing the divine hierarchy forward. They were pushing themselves up, and they were not spreading themselves out. They were not heeding the call to fill the earth. It's a complicated subject. I hope you will kind of take it in the spirit that it was given as a meditation. And as always, my meditations are unfinished meditations. I don't submit them as, kind of completed ideas. But there are things that I am working on that I hope will inspire you to work on some things and to consider some things and to enter into your meditations and reflections and contemplations in that spirit of being willing to hear what is new and not simply regurgitating your own concerns, but allowing yourselves to go into the wilderness of meditation and to hear what the wilderness has to say. Amen.